Hi, so today we are going to look at techniques to understand a little bit what's happening actually in a deep network. So we have seen that network can basically approximate any functional, can solve very complicated problems, but so far we have a very poor understanding of what is actually happening. So the tools to understand a network's behavior are quite limited. And we are going to see a few of them which have been developed for feed-forward networks. So the first thing we are going to see is how we can look at network parameters as images. So in the case of ConvNet, the filters can be seen and visualized to some extent as vignettes, as small images. We can also look at how the activations in the network represent the input. Since they keep this image structure, we can visualize them as images. We'll then see how we can look at not individual processing of individual samples, but the actual distribution of the population of samples. That will give us an intuition of the type of the transformation of the space itself that a network is doing. Then we can look at how changing the input impacts the output. So basically to look at the derivative of the response or responses of intermediate activations with respect to input. And then we will finish with actually crafting from zero, from scratch, examples which induce maximum response from the network or even a very wrong response from the network. So the first thing we can do, which can already give you a little intuition of what happens in simple case, is to look at MLP from two dimensions to two classes. So a standard binary classification problem in 2D. And let's consider a model like this, so one hidden layer perceptron. So it has two inputs corresponding to the y and the x and y coordinate of a point. Then a nonlinearity, then a bunch of hidden layers, and a nonlinearity, and then two units as output corresponding to the two classes. What is interesting is that every single of the hidden units can be seen as can be represented as a line corresponding to the boundary between the part of the domain where it responds 0 and the part of the domain where it's negative, the part of the domain where it's positive. So every single of those hidden units has a bias on the direction. So we can see it as we can represent this domain which is a line, so which is the point in the plan where the unit is equal to 0. On one side of this line, the unit is positive, on the other side, it's negative. So during separation, those lines are going to move around. So the boundaries, the decision separation of the units are going to move. And we see that they get arranged into a way that allows the final decision to be made. So we will start with a standard synthetic example where the positive class is inside the disk, and the negative side is outside the disk. So the red area here is the ground truth. And each one of those green lines correspond to the separation boundary of one hidden unit. Okay. So when the training goes on, after 4 iterations like this, and the shade of gray, of course, is a before threshold response of the network. And we see that what happens is that the units during training are moving around and arranging themselves in a radial manner. So in the end, we see that the final decision boundary, the final decision is the thresholding of something which has probably the shape of a cone, and which is the sum of a bunch of hyperplanes, the sum of ReLU thresholded linear functional, where the zeros are those green lines. So we see that those zeros correspond to the corners of the final decision. A more complicated case is this problem where now the ground truth is positive in the disk and negative outside. And what we can do is, again, to do the training and look at the location of the hyperplanes, and we see that the hidden units are arranging themselves to do the classification. And we see that here there is a problem that one of the units should move so that it could separate the two populations. And as long as it's not the case, we are not able to classify properly in the middle. But suddenly, at this iteration, this unit moved, and now is able to separate the two properly. So this is a very synthetic example, and I'm okay. It's this on the few coming slides. I'm not convinced I say much, but at least I can give you a very little intuition of what's going on. You can get a sense that how you can get trapped in Cal minimum, where you have certain units which have to choose their side and they do not, so they remain stuck into a non-useful position. We can also see that those units are probably stuck because after the non-linearities, the ReLU part makes the gradient flat on this side, all those guys are responding 0 on the no gradient. So it gives you a sense how, a vague sense maybe, but at least it's already something, how the combination of units can finally do something. It also, for me, what is also counterintuitive result, that a priori I would have imagined that the units would place themselves at the boundary, and really that, for instance, this shape would be due to a unit passing through, but it's actually not the case. The bias can be arbitrary. It does not. The thresholding in the end depend on arbitrary bias also. So they can really arrange themselves as long as they are arranged in radial manner. They allow to approximate this kind of disk shape. So now what we can do is to look at a more realistic case, convolutional neural network. So the analysis I just showed with this simple 2D example cannot be generalized because the linear operation done by in a high dimension cannot be represented anymore as an upper plane, something that we can visualize in low dimension. So what we can do is to look at the filters themselves. So we can even expect that the filters in the first layer really look at the image itself, so they should somehow be little pieces of image that hopefully may make sense to us. So if we train a LeNet on NIST and we look at all the 32 filters, so here it's a LeNet with 32 channels in the first hidden layer, so it's 32 convolutional filters. We see that it's not so convincing. We have some filters that look a bit like oblique edge detectors and oblique edge detectors again, and ridge detector and stuff like that, even though it's not so clear. And if we go to the first hidden layer, so now in the second convolution layer, for this network we go from 32 to 64 channels, which means that we have 64 channels themselves, so 64 filters themselves composed of 32 little vignettes, images. So each of those columns show you 32, all the 32 images that associated to one filter, and this is super hard to interpret. So maybe if we are working hard, we could do something. We could conclude that it extracts some structure at a higher level, but this is less than clear. If we go to an AlexNet trained on ImageNet, the standard AlexNet, and the one in PyTorch, available in Torch Vision, and we look at the layers in the first the filters in the first convolutional layers. So the input is a RGB image with 3 channels, and we have 64 filters in the first layer. Here I'm showing the 21st. Each of them can be decomposed as 3 filters, 3 grayscale filters. So this one would be the filtering of the red area, of the red channels, green channels, blue channel. And each of those columns correspond to one of the 64 filters, and we have 20 of them total. We can also represent each of them as colors by just interpreting this as red, green, blue. And we obtain filters which are far more structured than the ones we saw for NIST. So this is quite convincing. It shows that the first convolution layer of AlexNet really extracts some high frequency zebra patterns on some ridges, on some corners, on some colorful edges and stuff like that. So this is quite satisfying. Now if we move to the second conv layer, that's a big mess. If we really try hard, we may find some high frequency zebra pattern and maybe some flat detector in some channels while it's picking some more centered structure in others. But all in all, it's quite difficult to give a precise sense to this. Another way of visualizing what's going on is to, at least in the case of the convnets again, is to put an image as input to the network and then to look at convolutional layers, at the activation maps themselves as images. Since they maintain the structure of the image, we can envision every single channel as a grayscale image or signed image. So this is what we can do. Because there are a lot of channels in every layer, we just have to pick a few of them at random. An important thing is that it's again a bit the same as for PCA. The representation is distributed across multiple channels. So if you have a standard ConvNet with hundreds of channels, basically you can do a rotation in the basis which is encoded by the channel. So there is no reason one of the channel, a single channel, has a particular meaning, except maybe if you train it with dropout, channel dropout, so the conv2D dropout, in which case it may happen, but this is often not the case. So here, those are the activation map for a net NIST. So this is a standard NIST character in grayscale. This is the same NIST character displayed with a color code for the sign. So red is highly positive, blue is negative, and white is 0. And so this is the input layer, one channel. And then we go to after the first convolutional layer. So what we see is one activation map per filter. We have a few of them. This is after the first ReLU. Then we go to the second, after max pooling, second common layer, etc. So what we see again is quite hard to understand what's going on after this, but here at least we see that it clearly has a semantic of edge detectors. We see that it clearly highlights some horizontal edge that go from that has dark above and light below, or the other way around, like this guy, or this guy maybe. And then you have also vertical edges, and you have corner, diagonal edges, etc. So we are quite happy with this. If we move to ImageNet and we fill it with RGB image, so here I encode, so I probably messed up the order of the channel because this looks like highly blue. So it's probably blue, green, red. So we get the 3 original channels, and then when we go into the channels with AlexNet, again we have something that looks a lot like edge detector kind of stuff, and then ReLU, and then after the max pooling it's quite complicated, and then we can believe that some of the structure we have high detection of certain parts may make sense at a semantic level. Maybe it's detecting, maybe we can go back. So we have the greenish part is the grass. We could imagine that this, for instance, in the late layer is able to detect a border. So here. Now if we go to a ResNet, so it's a similar stuff, except that the ResNet maintains the resolution more. Again, we see that here we can still see things. So the thing is that it's very hard. There are so many channels and so many filters and so many things going on. It's quite hard to pinpoint clearly and immediately just by looking at stuff at random things. So in 2015, Yosinski and colleagues developed an interactive tool to try to visit and to analyze activations happening in a network. And using this, they were able to find units with a clear semantic in an AlexNet-like network trained on ImageNet. So in particular, they have this quite nice result where one of the units in some of the later layers is perfectly tuned to face detection, whether it's human or animals. So it's interesting because there is no face class in ImageNet. There are other classes. And so indirectly, through the labeling with other classes, the network was able to develop a face detection unit, which is useful for other classes. So this is very satisfying in terms of the ability, a proof that of the ability of the network to develop a part-like semantic, even though this semantic is never provided to it during training in the labeling. Another example, this one is something I did 2 years ago. The idea was to try to train a network to predict the dynamic of objects in the plan. So it's based on a simple physics simulator. So here what you can see is we have a starting configuration of rectangles, a grasping point, and then we apply a force upward for a while, and we get a final configuration. Okay, so you see that, for instance, here we are grabbing this rectangle, the grabbing point is there, and then we move it upward for a while, and we get this configuration. Here we grab this rectangle there, and we push it upward, and we see that it turns. And the idea was to train a network so that, given those two images, the grasping point and the starting configuration, it had to predict the resulting configuration. So really, those were given as images, so those were given as a two-channel image, input image, and the network had to, it was a ResNet with 9 blocks of 2 layers. It was trained to predict the final configuration in a L2 sense, so the loss was L2. And so we see here, for example, and what was quite surprising to me, that with only 20,000 examples, the network was able to learn quite reasonably the dynamic. So for instance, here we see some results. This is the starting configuration, grasping point. Here's the true resulting image where I highlight the pixels which have changed. So here the pixels are multiplied by something that increases with their difference with the starting configurations. It's just for the clarity, so that we see quickly what has moved, and it makes sense. This rectangle was grabbed there and moved upward, so it turned. And here what we see is the prediction from the network. So those are test images, and we see that it works quite well because it learns the torque, which I find surprising. It also learned chain of collisions, and it also learned the boundary limits. So here it could not move more than that. Here it's another picture showing the performance of the network. So here what I did was to generate 1,000 test configurations, and to rank them by the error between the difference between the predicted configuration, which is here, and the ground truth configuration. So this is the worst prediction of the network, second worst, third worst among 1,000, and those are the median ones, around 512. And what we see is that, I find this very, very interesting, that when it fails, it's because here, for instance, it believed that this rectangle, when it was grabbed and moved, would probably not touch this other one. So here we see that it's quite undecided, but finally, even though it moved a little bit, this rectangle did not move it enough and just let this one pass. And this is the worst prediction. Here, similarly, we see that it probably believed that this rectangle would not collide this other one, could pass without colliding, and actually there was a chain of collision that was not anticipated. So what is impressive is that otherwise it learned very well. The torque, the very notion that there are rectangles, it's just provided an image of black and white pixels, so it had to infer that those pixels correspond to the boundaries of rigid forms that move in a rigid manner and can only rotate. It has to learn that there are torque, and there are collisions, and there is translations, and there are frictions. So it was really quite complicated, and it fails when the signal is kind of at interface between two possible solutions, and the network has no way of predicting some kind of bimodal result. So it had to settle for some kind of compromise between what could be possible futures, and it behaves well bad in that case. So now I'm showing this because it's interesting. The network being quite small, we can look at what's going on. So here, each row corresponds to the output of one of the blocks of the ResNet. So again, it's a standard ResNet, so you have blocks of 2 layers with batch norm and ReLU. And what we see is that we have 16 channels. We have the 2 starting images. Then we have the 16 channels at the end of the first block, 16 channels at the output of the second block, 16 channels output of the third block, etc. So it's to show, this is a nice illustration of how magic it is, because we see that it, for instance, it built, if you check this here, it built an image with the moving part removed, and then it also built some images where, by doing some kind of flooding, it tried to guess what is the rectangle which is moving, and it creates other parts where the moving parts have been removed. So on the one hand, we see roughly some of the stuff happening. On the other hand, it's not clear exactly how the magic happens, but it gives a sense that indeed processing happens in different channels doing different stuff. And if we go to another example where actually it grabs one, but 2 are moving, we see that some of the map are highlighting only the rectangle which is grasped, and the other ones, other rectangles which are moving, for instance here. And again, we see that it builds area, the image without the moving parts here. So it's quite of an illustration of the things happening in parallel on the successive processing, which allows to build finally the final response. Again, a lot of edge-like maps and flooding maps to detect which parts are moving. So now, after this, and I'm perfectly aware that what I've shown so far just give for the most an impression of complexity, and it does not really shine a light on what is actually going on. Maybe it gives a vague intuition, but it's still not clear. We cannot get a big picture of what happened in the network. So maybe a more efficient way of envisioning this is to see the network as a succession of embeddings. So in some way, when you have when your final goal is classification, what you want is that the final layer will do a simple decision. It's linear. It cannot do some complicated stuff, which means that for this final layer to be able to make a proper job, the data have to be prepared before, so they have to be entangled in some way. So what we can do to make this more concrete and to have a representation that may clarify this intuition is now to look at the activation on a single sample, but at the activation of a population samples, and to see how those populations, what are the shapes of those populations in the space. The problem we have to face is a sort of curse of dimensionality, which in that case is the fact that human brains are not tuned to visualize stuff in more than 2 or 3 dimensions. And those dimensions we have to deal with are quite high, because, for instance, a NIST sample of 28 one channel is 784 dimensions. And then if we just go through a standard LeNet, it goes up to 18,000 dimensions. If we consider an ImageNet, standard ImageNet 224 3-channel sample, it's 150K dimensions, and it goes up to 800,000 dimensions into ResNet 152. So to be able to do what I'm suggesting, which is to look at the shapes of the populations of samples in space, we need a way of projecting these very high dimensions into a lower dimension, 2D in that case, to have it on a screen, so that it will be compatible with our human representation, which is 2D or 3D in the best case. So we saw that PCA or K-means are standard ways of reducing dimension while keeping information, but they very poorly capture the structure if your manifold is not flat, or in the case of PCA, or clearly dispatched into clusters in the case of K-means. So there is a lot of methods to do this, to do the same kind of dimension reduction in a more sophisticated manner, and mostly in a way that would be able to deal with curvature. So if you have, for instance, something which is on a cylinder, or on the famous Swiss roll, which looks like a sheet of paper which is rolled, there are plenty of methods to do this, and the very popular one these days is TSNE, which was developed in 2008, and this is the one we are going to use for our experiments. So the idea is that you are given a bunch of points in a very high dimension space, so hundreds, thousands, or hundreds of thousands dimension, and the goal is to associate to these endpoints as many points, but now in a very small dimension, like 2 or 3, so that now we can look at this. And the idea is that you want to do this so that geometrical properties of the y-ends in low dimension will properly reflect the geometrical properties of the x's in high dimension, especially neighborhoods. You want the neighborhoods to be maintained, and ideally even metrics. You want the distance to be maintained. So TSNE is a method designed to do so. And what it does is to optimize with stochastic gradient descent the location of the y-eyes, so that the distance between them reflects the distance between the x's. So more precisely, I had a bunch of slides to explain this, but maybe I thought it was overkill for a deep learning course. The overall idea that you take the x's, now you consider each of them individually, and given each of them, you look at all the others, and you put on all the others a probability which is basically a normalized Gaussian weight. So you put a weight to all the for every point, you put a weight on all the others, a kind of a probability of transitions, which would be what would be the probability to go there if you jump with a Gaussian distribution around you until you meet one of your neighbors. What would be the probability to meet one of your neighbors? So now you get a square matrix, which is for every starting point and every arriving point, you have a probability of jump. And what you do is to pick your y's, so that using the same kind of probability of transitions now in the plan, let's say if you want to project in 2D, if you use the same kind of probability recipe for a probability of jump in this low dimension space, you should match the probabilities in the original space. So again, to put it simply, to try to summarize, you associate to every pair of x's in the original space a probability of jump, which is a probability to jump from the first to the second if you are jumping from the first with a Gaussian distribution around you. And then you optimize your y so that the same recipe on the y's give you the same probability of jump. So actually, TSNE, there is one more level. In the second, in the low dimension space, instead of using a Gaussian, you use a T distribution, so a student T distribution. So that there is some things that in a very high dimension, you tend to have everybody very close at the same distance to you. There is a weird effect of the high dimension, which is the distance between all the points is the same. So if you take any point, all the others are basically on a thick sphere around it. So they tend to be packed. And so using a student T distribution in the low dimension space works better. But in the end, to summarize, you take your x's in high dimension and you optimize your y's in low dimension so that the distribution of points around any point is kind of preserved. And now we can do this in PyTorch very easily by using the scikit-learn, so the fantastic Python ecosystem. So this technique has been implemented in scikit-learn in the manifold package. So if you want to use TSNE in PyTorch, you simply import from scikit-learn the TSNE from the manifold package. You import TSNE. And now if the X tensor contains the original X's, so it's a 2D tensor with as many rows as you have samples, as many columns as you have dimension in the original space, you first convert this tensor to a NumPy tensor with a NumPy method, and then you call TSNE by telling it as argument what is the number of dimension in your arriving space, in the projecting space. So here I want only 2 dimensions. And also you have to give a perplexity argument, which means stand for the number of points what is the size of a neighborhood of any points in the original space. So here I'm saying I consider that basically every point has 50 meaningful neighbors in the original space. The method is quite stable to this, so it's not a parameter that you have to tune extensively. Putting any value between 10 and 100 usually does the trick. And then we call the TSNE algorithm itself, and then we come back from the NumPy tensor to the torch tensor. So just doing this import and executing those 3 lines, I end up with in the tensor y a meaningful 2D non-linear 2D projection of the tensor x, so that the configuration, the metric structure of the y's reflect properly the metric structure of the x's. Okay. So we can look at how it behaves on a simple example. So this is the so-called Swiss roll, which is a bunch of points located on a curved manifold. Here you have 1 point per dot, so there are so many of them that we don't realize it, but it's actually a bunch of dots. And I have put a color code so that we can see where it goes. And here's the projection by TSNE in 2D. So we see that because TSNE uses SGD, it's a greedy algorithm, so it was trapped in a local minimum. It could not unfold properly and reconnect properly all the pieces to make a proper rectangle, but it's still very good because here I really tuned nothing. It was my first run just to have an honest assessment of TSNE on this simple example, but it basically does what we wanted to do, because we see that, for instance, those bunch of dark dots are together, that the rows are preserved, that they are neighbors to the red, which is neighbor to the green. Then you have a weird stuff, but then again you have the blue area, which is next to the yellow, which is next to the light blue, etc., down to the purple ones. So TSNE does a very good job. It's usually a very pleasant tool to use because it gives you very nice results. And now we can apply this to what is our main topic of interest today, which is to visualize what's going on in a network. So here, the color code corresponds to the NIST dataset classes. So you have 10 colors corresponding to the 10 digits. And here, it's simply TSNE applied to a bunch of samples taken at random in the original space. So here I took something like 1,000, or I don't remember, let's say 5,000 points. And they are in the original space of dimension 784. And I just run TSNE, project to 2D, and plot the points with the color code corresponding to the class. And this shows that NIST is actually an easy data set because the classes are already pretty well clustered through TSNE, which did not have enough even access to the classes. So it was simply a geometric-based the dimension reduction, and it keeps already the classes together, which means that samples from a certain class were close to each other in the original space. And now what we can do is to go through the different layers of the LeNet, extract for every sample all the encoding in the different convolution layers, make them a 1D vector, and apply TSNE again with the samples now encoded in this space. So here we are in the first convolutional layer, fourth, we directly jump to fourth, seventh, ninth, and then we are done. So this is basically where we make the decision. So it's just to show, again, we can go through the layers, original data, first layer, fourth, seventh, and ninth. And we see that the network has entangled the populations. So it has successively pushed every class from each other so that in the end, when you reach the last layer, the decision is quite easy to make. Now we can move to a more complicated case, which is CIFAR. So here I train my own ResNet with 66 layers, no pooling, etc. on CIFAR 10. And now I'm going to visit again the layers one after another. So this is CIFAR in the input layer, so the raw signal. We see that now that's the real deal because it's far more complicated. Here the classes are really mixed with each other. This is our first layer 5, 10, 15. It looks quite nice, it's Gaussian, and we see some kind of more homogeneity in the classes here and there. 20, 25, 30, 31, 32, and now it starts to look quite nice. We have the red are here, the blue is here, purple is there, yellow is there. So it really means that each class is made more compact and more separated from the other. 33, 34, 35, and here now we are good. We really have the classes are separated in their own space. And here we jump to a layer where I do channel averaging and final decision. This is from where I do the final decision. So here it's an interesting visualization way of visualizing the internal activation because it shows the behavior of the network at the population level. It's actually untangling the space. It really tries to successively make the populations in their own little clusters so that the decision can be made. And it's also, I think, quite consistent with this view that we got from the fully convolutional network that it's really not first I extract features and then I make a decision. It's really like a gradual process where the space is more and more deformed so that at some point we are converging from raw signal to semantic, but it's a very gradual thing. It's not like, it makes no sense to say, oh, now I've done enough and now I make the decision. It's really something that happens progressively. So another family of methods look at the relation between the input and the output or some intermediate representation in the network. So the first one of those methods, probably the simplest, is the occlusion, to compute the occlusion, so-called occlusion sensitivity. So to do so, what we do is that we first take an input image, in the case of a standard ConvNet, and we look at the maximally responding output unit of the network and that image. And then we look at the value of this unit when we occlude a part of the image. We can do this by moving the occluding part through the image, which means that for every single location we have this delta between the value of the unit when the part is not occluded and the value of the unit when the part is occluded. Doing so is quite expensive because it means that you are going to do a forward pass for every single location of the occluding mask. So in practice what it means, we are going to look at some results over those 4 images for most of the method we will see in the next slides. So what we do is that we take this input image, we run it through, for instance, an AlexNet, we compute what is the output unit responding the most. So it's trained on ImageNet, so we pick what unit among the 1000 output units respond the most. And then what we do is that we can occlude a part of the image, and for every location of this little gray square, we can compute as how much the unit which was the most responding on this one, how much it changes. So the algorithm is quite simple. We take the full image, run it through the network, pick the maximum responding unit, and now we are going to move through the image at every single location this square mask and compute the response of the same unit that we picked on this one for every location. So which means that for every location in the image, we have this delta between original response and response with the box at this location. I insist. So what we can do now is to do this on those 4 images with AlexNet, and we get those occlusion sensitivity maps. So this is a mask of 3232 on the stride of 2, so I don't look at every location because to save a bit of computation. And this is done with AlexNet, and it's quite satisfying. So what the red area here means that when you occlude the head of the... So here, yeah, the color code is as always, red means very positive, blue means very negative. And I compute the value of the unit with the original value minus the value with occlusion, which means that when we occlude the head of the dog, the response goes down a lot because it's very red. When you occlude the back of the elephant or the ear of the elephant, it goes down a lot, etc. We can be surprised with the penguin that the head of the penguin does not seem to matter much, the body matters a lot, and this leg matters a lot. And for the cars, we are happy to see the wheels are very are an important cue for making the decision. If we move to VG16, the same kind of behavior, but the head of the penguin is even less important. When we occlude it, the response goes up. Here we see that the front part of the car, and the top of the car, and the roof, and the back of the pickup is important. VG16 is similar. Another type of technique are the silency maps and variants. So here, to avoid having to pass to compute multiple forward paths, we directly compute the gradient of the maximally responding output unit with respect to the input. So we usually what we do is to compute the derivative of the response with respect to the parameters of the model. But here, what we are going to do is to use the auto-differentiation mechanism, the autograph of PyTorch, to compute the derivative with respect to the input. Okay, so I use this notation given x as we take the gradient with respect to x. So in the next slide, what we do is this can be implemented in PyTorch very easily. What we are going to do is we build a variable from the image, we compute the output, we look at the loss, which for loss the value of the correct unit. This loss is just picking a single value, and the target is the correct one. And we do the loss backward, but since we have said that requires equal grad for the input, we will get the gradient of this guy. And now what we can, this is the first option, using backward. The second option is to use torch autograph.grad, which basically is the same. You put your variable, your input in your image in a variable where you require the gradient, compute the output, compute the loss, so the response of the correct unit. But instead of doing backward, which would change also the gradient of the parameters, which you may not want, by doing grad input equal torch.autograph.grad, you just get the gradient of the loss with respect to the input. Technical point, there is a comma here because this guy always return a tuple, because since function they get several tensors as parameters, the gradient is always a bunch of tensors. So now we can look at what we obtain. So again, we push this guy through AlexNet, look at the value of the correct output unit and compute the gradient of this output unit with respect to the input tensor, and then we compute the sum, the absolute value through the 3 channels of the input tensor, and then we sum them. So again, maybe it's a bit confusing. We take the image, push it through the network, pick the unit, the correct unit, compute the derivative of this output unit value with respect to the input tensor, and what we get is a gradient tensor of same dimension as the input tensor. So we get a gradient tensor which is width times height times 3 channels. And then what we do is to take the absolute value onto some cross channels. So bottom line, black here means that changing this area of the image will change a lot, activation of the correct unit. White means it does not matter. So we are quite happy because we see that the head of the dog matters. Very similar stuff as with the occlusion thing. We see that the ears on the back of the elephant matters, that the body of the penguin matters. Now we may leave those figures quite dissatisfied because they are very noisy. And this has been pointed out last year by Smirkov et al. And they simply plotted this graph to illustrate why there is so much noise. So here what they do is that they picked an image, created a slightly noisy version of it just by adding a very small Gaussian noise to every pixel, so 0.01 standard deviation. So this is X, original image X, and this is X plus epsilon, where epsilon is a little bit of Gaussian noise, so little that it does not change anything to the human eyes. And what they do then is to move along this line, going from X to X plus epsilon, and for every location, for every value of on this line between X and, so here you are at X and here you are at X plus epsilon, they look at the derivative of the output with respect to each one of the component of a certain pixel. And what you can see is that the derivative changes quite a lot when you move along this line, which means that just by changing a little bit, by moving a little bit around the per image, the gradient constantly changes and then changes sign, which means that basically the noise we see due to this instability. And their solution to this was to compute not simply the gradient of the output with respect to the input, but to first generate a bunch of slightly randomized version of the input just by adding several times a bit of Gaussian noise, and to compute the same gradient but now averaged through those noisy versions. So it can be formulated that way. They are going to sample n noisy version of the input. For each of them, they add a little bit of noise with a Gaussian noise at every pixel. And they compute the gradient of the output with respect to X for this slightly noisy version. And then they take the average of the gradient. So again, in PyTorch, how can we do this? We are going to look at 100 randomized version of the input. We compute the standard deviation of the noise we are going to use as a fraction of the delta between the max value of the tensor and the minimum value. So this is a parameter that we will set to 1/4. This is computed based on the signal. We set to 0 a tensor where we are going to sum all those gradients of the noisy versions. Now we are going to repeat n base smooth times, so 100 times. Okay, if it was done properly, I would have done this with mini batches, but I was too lazy to do this. Then we create a noisy input, so I take my original image and I add a bunch of normal noise, so a tensor of same size, mean 0, and standard deviation, this guy. Then I create a noisy input, which is a variable where built from this tensor where I require the gradient. I compute my output, compute the value of the proper unit, and then I compute my gradient with respect to the input of this unit, and I accumulate this, and in the end I sum across channels the absolute value of this guy. And then I normalize between 0 and 1 to make the grayscale image. And we get far better images because if this was the original gradient that we saw in the previous slides, here's this smooth grad, so the version where we sample a bunch of slightly noisy versions and average the gradient, and we see that it's far better. So now we see even the pavement, and we see the little blue dress of the dog, and we see the legs of the elephant, we see the ears better, and this is AlexNet. If we go to VGG16 or VGG19, it's quite impressive. So just this very little change, instead of computing the gradient of the proper unit with respect to the input, you do this several times for slightly noisy version of the image. You get those very nice highlighting of the part of the image that actually impact the final response of the network. So here we are very happy, actually. We should not be blasé. Here, this shows that the network actually looks at what matters in the image to take a decision, because here, again, the network does not care about this whatever, this metal thing. Here it does not care about the mountains, it does not care about the trees. Here it has filtered out some structure on the ice. Here it has completely filtered out the houses and the trees. Maybe not the trees, maybe you have more pickups when you have not trees, but whatever, pylons. But all the background has been removed. So here it's quite a confirmation that the ConvNets actually look where they're supposed to look to make a decision. So then there are other variants around the same theme of computing the derivative of the output with respect to the input. So Ziller and Fergus propose what they call the deconvolutional network, where they tried really to build a sort of a reverse processing of what a network, a ConvNet, is doing. And in practice, what they obtain is very similar to the backward pass, except when they go through the ReLU layers. So if you do your backward pass, you compute at the end the derivative of, for instance, a unit response or your loss with respect to the final activations you computed. And then you are going back through all the layers. And every time you meet a ReLU layer, if the derivative of the loss with respect to, or the derivative of the quantity of interest with respect to the result of the ReLU layer is equal to this, then the derivative of the same quantity with respect to the input to the ReLU layer is equal to this. It's simply that if S was in the positive values, it influences the ReLU behaves like the identity, so you get this value unchanged. And if S was on the negative side, then the ReLU is flat and the gradient is killed, so this quantity would be 0. What Ziller and Fergus proposed was to not, when you're doing the backward pass, not weighting through the ReLU using the derivative of the ReLU, but weighting according to if the input influences positively the final thing. So they want to highlight what are the inputs which changes, a positive change would make the quantity goes up. So in the end, it means that instead of having the usual derivative of, you are going to propagate your derivative by multiplying the derivative of ReLU, you multiply by the indicator function of your derivative being positive. And finally, there was an extension of Ziller's deconvolution network in 2014 called the guided backpropagation, where they take the both. So they are going to, when they go through ReLU, they are going to multiply the loss that they get, the derivative of the loss with respect to the output of the ReLU layer. They are going to multiply it by both the derivative of ReLU, which is this guy, and by an indicator function of this quantity impacting positively the loss, the quantity of interest. So now we get those three variants. The first one is to use simply backprop, so it's what we saw before. You are going to forward your signal fully through the network, pick the unit of interest, and then propagate backward the derivative of the quantity of interest until you reach the input, and then you will have a way, you will know what are the parts of the image that influence the output. So deconvolution does something similar, but now it's going to keep, when you go through layers, only the unit which change is going to impact positively the output value. And the guided backprop is going to take the both, which means they are going to propagate only if the change of this activation is going to increase, the positive change of the activation is going to increase positively the final response, and also it's not on the flat area, so it will actually open. The structure is already there in some sense. Here they are going to propagate if a structure makes the response more positive, even if the structure is not there. Here it's going to propagate whatever is unchanged if the structure is there, and here it's going to change to propagate only if the structure is already there, so you are not on the flat area of ReLU, and if you move a little bit positively, you are going to change positively the final value. So here it's a good opportunity to discuss the hook in PyTorch, because it's quite easy to say, oh, I'm going to rewrite, I'm going to use to do a backward pass, but I'm just going to change what happens when we backwards through ReLU. But it's quite a challenging problem, because now if I give you a network with ReLU everywhere, how do you do this? How are you changing the backward pass through ReLU? And actually PyTorch implements the notion of hook, which are functions that you can attach to a module and which be called either during the forward or during the backward pass. You have hooks for both. You have hooks for forward pass and hooks for the backward pass. And if you attach a hook to a module, then when you call the forward method of this module, your hook, your function will be called. So we can look at this in practice. So here I define a tensor of whatever its size, and then I define a module which is ReLU. If I apply my module to X, I get this following result. Now what I can do is to define a function called myHook. It has to get as argument a module, an input tensor and an output tensor, and then I can attach it with m.registerForwardHook, my hook. So here I'm saying, okay, I want to attach this method as a hook to this guy, to m, and this hook has to be called every time we call the forward pass, and it will be called with, in that case, m as first argument, the input as second argument, and the output that m has computed as third argument. Okay? And here what I did was to define a function that does nothing but simply prints a message. So otherwise it lets standard forward pass does its job. So now if I call m of x, what happens is that I see my little message printed by my thing. So after the register forward hook, if I call forward again by calling m parenthesis x, sorry, everything happens as before, except that before coming back from forward, my stuff will be called, my function, my hook will be called, and it will be called with m as first argument. So it prints a string of m, give you the ReLU parenthesis, got, and then I have the size, I print the size of the tensor I got as input, which is of size 2, which is consistent between this guy. And then you get the result as before. If you call handle.remove, so when you call register forward hook, you get back a handle that allows you to remove the hook if you want. So if you call handle.remove, and you call again the forward of m, you get, then your hook is not called anymore. Okay? So now we can implement the deconvolution as follows by, by using a backward hook. So I define this little function called ReLU backward deconv hook that gets a module, what was the gradient with respect to the input and the gradient with respect to the output. And what I do, so this is the backward hook, you can return a value which will be used in place of the standard backward operation, which means that my hook now not only can do something like print stuff, but it can also return a new quantity, and this quantity will be used in place of the standard backward pass. So now I wrote a second function that allow you to equip a model with my hook. So what you give it a model as parameter. It goes through model.modules, which is an iterator through all the modules composing the model. And every time it finds a ReLU, so if is instance m of n ReLU, so this is standard Python, I'm going to register my hook, ReLU backward deconv hook, to the module. So now how can I implement GradView? I get a model, I get an image to pass through my model, I create a transform, I create a transform to convert the image to tensor from the image. I convert my image from a Python image library image format. So yeah, sorry, image name is a file. So here I load it from disk. I get my tensor by using this function. I renormalize everything by making the mean 0.5, standard deviation 0.5. If I have CUDA, I move my tensor, my input tensor to CUDA. Then I build a variable which is a single batch. I keep the number of channels, heights and widths unchanged. I also state that I will need the gradient with respect to this quantity, this tensor. And then I move through my model. And then what I do is that I compute the gradient of the maximally responding unit in my output. And then I renormalize the result divided by the max and adding 0.5. Okay? So quite easy stuff. I load the image, move it on CUDA, make it a tensor of size 1, and move my model. So the backward hook, a function to equip a model with a hook, and a function which, given a model and an image name, will load the image, do the forward pass and the backward pass, and return the resulting tensor for the derivative. And now to use all this, I first load a model VGG16 pre-trained, I put it in eval mode. Here I chop the network and keep only the feature transformation. I drop the final decision, the final fully connected layers. I equip my model with deconvolution. I call my grad view method with my model and my image blacklab.jpg, and then I save with Torch Vision, save image, I save my result on the disk. And we can use a very similar code for guided backprop. So if you remember, guided backprop was very similar to the deconvolution, except that instead of having simply the backward pass here was simply ReLU of the grad output instead of what would be the standard stuff, which is the indicator function of the input. Now the backward, so I store during the forward pass, I have to attach two hooks, one in which I will store the forward pass, what was my input, and then when I get to do the backward, what I do with that, I multiply the ReLU of the grad output, this is similar to guided backprop, time ReLU of the input that I kept. I take the sign, so this stuff will be 0 or 1. This is the derivative, the sign of ReLU is the derivative of ReLU. So again, here I have to equip my modules with not only a hook for the backward, but a hook for the forward to keep a track of the input so that I can compute this quantity. And then same equip model will be similar. You give me a model and I go through all the modules. Every time I meet ReLU, I attach a forward and a backward hook. And now, if I run all this, this is what I get. So again, my original images, my AlexNet, and I look at the gradient of the maximum responding feature. Again, I top off the connected and keep only I look at the unit responding maximally in the last feature layer. And this is what the derivative with respect to the input looks like. So here, what is the color code? Since I look at the derivative with respect to the input, and the input being RGB image, I get a tensor which has 3 channels on the same resolution as the image, so it makes naturally color images, where the zeros has been moved to 1/2, so gray is 0. Okay, darker would mean negative, lighter would mean positive in all channels. So we see that the maximally responding unit on the hot dog is for the head, the maximally responding unit for the elephant seems to be the legs, maximally responding unit for the penguins is the head, and maximally responding unit for the truck seems to be over there on the windshield. Again, maximally responding unit does not mean the most important to make the final decision. It means the maximally responding unit on this image in this network. If we move to deconvolution with the same stuff, deconvolution of the maximally responding unit, we get this, which is far better. So deconvolution is really neat. We see the head of the dog quite nicely, the elephant, the penguin on the car. And if we go to guided backprop, which is in some ways a product of standard gradient descent and the deconvolution of Ziller and Fergus, we get something very nice, the head of the dog and the legs of the... So this is AlexNet. Now the same with VGG, so gradient, deconvolution, which has, it's something it seems that happens, it's quite documented that deconvolution may create this kind of strange interference-like pattern on the images, and the guided backprop is beautiful. Guided backprop is really absolutely neat. So we see that the maximally responding unit sees the head of the dog, the head of the elephant, head of the penguin on the front part of the car, and VGG19 is also quite similar. And in their paper from 2014, and Ziller and Fergus did a bit more of an analysis, so they looked at an intermediate unit in the network and they collected the patches which were making units respond the most, and also computed the convolution. And it's quite neat because you see that in layer 1, the units are really coding more like a simple edge sort of structure. If you go to the layer 2, you see that now it's more complicated. It's more like corners and curves and stuff like that. And you see that the pattern which maximize the response are quite more diverse. And then layer 3 is really like arrangement of small structures to create some regular patterns or very complicated combination of edges. And you start to have some upper torso detector and stuff like that. And then in the later layers, you really have complicated detectors of heads, and detectors of eyes, and the detectors of wheels and stuff like that. So those analysis really show that the network really captures stuff. It really captures parts which are meaningful for the decision. Finally, another type of techniques that may shine a light on what the network is doing consists of actually optimizing the input to maximize or minimize the response of certain units. So, for instance, what we can do is, in a very simple way, is to select a unit, an output unit of a network, say the one associated to the class dog, and then to optimize the input to the network, starting from random noise, to make this unit respond the most. So it would be done in a very simple way. You just start with an image which is generated at random, and then you do gradient descent to maximize a unit of a certain class. So if we do this, here it's an example with the class AlexNet on the class Bathtub on the left and Lipstick on the right. This is a bit too brutal, and we get some quite unrealistic images, so with high frequencies. And this may be surprising, but actually it's not, because those networks are trained with discriminative objectives, so they just try to separate classes from each other, which means that they make a decision based on what is the most the class which has the highest probability given the input signal. So in some way, it's like Bayesian inference with a uniform distribution over the uniform prior distribution over all the images. So in that case, since the network is trained in a discriminative manner, if you look at the log of the posterior distribution over the classes, this is the log of the probar of being of class 1. It increases linearly the more you are on the left. So if class 0 is distributed like this and class 1 is distributed like this, in simple case where the signal is one dimension, the log of the probar of being of class 1 increases linearly the more you go to the right. And if you just say, okay, give me the x between those two on the domain, the acceptable domain, give me the x that maximizes, this is the most likely to be of class 1, you get this guy, which maximizes the value f, which is your log, the log of the posterior probability with a flat prior. So to fix this and to get an x which is actually realistic under the actual population, so not simply the x that maximizes the response of the class, but actually which is so consistent with the very distribution of the class. What you can do is to switch to another prior, so something that corresponds to what you believe is a reasonable prior for all the classes together, and then you add this penalty term. So now you are doing Bayesian inference with a non-flat prior that will tend to prefer the samples more realistic. In that case, it corresponds to adding this penalty term to your f function. Now your f function minus this term looks like that, and the optimal is there, which is right in the class 1. So in practice, this will be done very easily. You just, instead of just looking at doing the gradient descent to maximize the value, the response of your unit, you are also going to minimize the penalty term, which will push the signal toward realistic images. So now what is a reasonable penalty term? Because in this simple example, it's very nice to have this little curve, but what can we use for real images? So what we saw is that very standard stuff is to have a very high frequencies that we know by experience please the network a lot. When you have high frequencies, they tend to hallucinate stuff easily. So it's what we are going to control. So what we are going to do is to put a penalty term that will force the optimization to put energy in all the frequency bands. So I'm not a signal processing person, so I'm going to explain this in a bit of a naive manner, but what we are going to do is we take the original image, blur it a little bit, compute the difference, and look at the L2 norm. Plus, we downscale this guy even more. We downscale this guy, blur it a little bit, compute the delta. Downscale it, blur it, compute the delta, downscale, blur, delta, downscale, blur, delta. And now we take the sum of the L2 norm of those guys. So basically this can be seen as the energy in the high frequencies, energy in the slightly lower frequencies, slightly lower, low frequencies. So instead of letting the optimization system accumulating all the energy over there, by taking the sum of the square of the L2 norm of those guys, we are going to force the system to kind of balance the energy across all the bands. So we will prevent it from putting everything there. It will have created some more realistic image. So now, how can we formalize this penalty term? It's simply the sum across scales of the images downscaled at this scale minus the blurred version of the downscaled image. So delta is the operator that divides the image by 2, downscaled it by a factor of 2. And G is a Gaussian kernel. So when I do this, I compute X, which has been downscaled S times, minus the blurry version of X, which has been downscaled S times. Okay. To implement a full optimization, we need first to have an implementation of the penalty term. So we implement it as a module. In the constructor, we create two tensors. One is a Gaussian kernel for the blurring, and the other one is a 2x2 uniform kernel for the downscaling. And in the forward pass, if we get a multi-channel image, we first unfold it as a batch of one-channel images, where the number of images now is multiplied by the number of channels. And if it's a single channel image, what we do is that we are going to downscale it as long as it's greater than 5 pixel width and 5 pixel height, which is the size of the kernel. We compute the blurry version of this image, accumulate in result the sum of the square of the difference of the pixels, and then we downscale the image and do it again. So basically, here we unfold, if it's multiple channels, we unfold it as many images of one channel. And here what we do is that we downscale the image as long as it's greater than 5 pixel width and height, and we compute the blurry image, sum the difference between the blurry and the X, and downscale the image, and return the overall sum. So now the full optimization is quite straightforward, thanks to AutoGrad. We first load the model, we take a VGG16 pre-trained, we put it in eval mode, we define our edge energy module for the penalty term, we create an image that we are going to optimize, which is a batch of one image, 3 channel, 224 to 24, filled with normal noise with very small standard deviation. Move all this on the GPU if needed. We put the input to optimize into a variable and state that we are going to require the gradient. We define an optimizer Adam with a learning rate of 0.1. And then we are going to iterate 250 gradient steps. We compute the output of the model over this input. We compute a loss, which is our penalty term, the edge energy, minus a certain quantity we want to maximize. In that case, I'm picking one of the output unit, and it's a 700 on ImageNet is paper 12. And I set my gradient to 0, compute my backward step, do my optimizer step, and when I'm done with the optimization, I get back the tensor of the resulting image, renormalize it, and save it with StartVision. And just take a second to think about the beauty of AutoGrad, because even though we have done very complicated steps, very complicated stuff, in particular in the multi-scale edge energy, we have those loops over the scales and all those complicated computation. In the end, we just need when we need the backward pass, it's done automatically. So those are some results. Here, it's not exactly what was in the previous piece of code, because instead of maximizing the response of one of the final unit, I'm maximizing the mean of the response of a certain channel in the force convolution layer. So each image corresponds to one channel picked at random, 6 of them total. And we see that we get quite nice images of textures when we try to maximize channels of the force convolution layer. Here, it's the same at 7th convolution layer. We see that we get higher frequency textures on most structures. They are quite nice. They look a bit like feather-like or scales-like. If we move to the 10th convolution layer, here instead of looking for the mean or the summed activation over a channel, I'm just picking a single unit and maximizing it. It's why in the two previous slides, the resulting image was defined as a full image support, while here a big chunk of the image is gray, which means the gradient was 0 there and it was not optimized. The image remained equal to the very small Gaussian noise we initialized it with. And the reason is that since this is an early convolution layer, a unit depends only on a small part of the image. This pixel, for instance, if I pick a center, the center unit in the 10th convolution layer, this pixel does not influence it because there is not enough convolution between the input and this unit to allow the information to flow from there to there. Those results are quite nice, as you can see. It generates quite highly structured things with curves and some feeling of even light effects and very nice colors and very nice almost relief structures. If we go to the 13th and last convolution layer, this is what we get. Again, quite nice. It really gives a sense of complexity and structure and organic complexity, and it's very, very convincing. And if we go to the last layer, so the output layer, and we pick a unit, this is the sort of things we get. So it's a bit in the form of a quiz. We have to guess what is this and what is that. So this is the unit king crab, and we see that there are structures a lot like crab legs or crab bodies. Here it's a samoyed, which is a sort of an Asian dog, and we see that indeed we have some of the heads and the ears. This is hourglass, and this is a paper towel, and it's very, very convincing. We really have the texture of paper towel. This is ping pong ball, and this is a steel arch bridge. Sunglasses and a geyser. So those results are very interesting because they show that although the network was trained in a discriminative manner, it contains information that has a generative property. So not only the information is there, and we have a way to retrieve it. So those results are very, very convincing. We start from noise image, we put a very simple signal processing regularization term, and still we get some images that contain big chunks, big parts of the actual class. It also shows that what are the shortcomings of the network. In particular, if we go back to the dog heads, we see that symmetry and rigidity are not really enforced, and which is something we observe. So the network does not have a model powerful enough to know this sort of long-term dependencies. But still, it shows that the learned model is actually quite consistent and not completely impossible to understand. It meets a bit our own way of understanding images. Another interesting approach to understanding what networks are doing, and in some way maybe it shows some problematic properties with the networks, is to build adversarial examples. So adversarial examples, the idea of adversarial examples is to optimize the input so that the network responds incorrectly. And it shows what we are going to see, that they show that the network is extremely unstable to its input. So even though we have this intuition that in the image space, the network has kind of a very smooth boundary between classes, and you have, for instance, the part of the space where it responds dog, and the part of the space where it responds cat, and the part of the space where it responds whatever. In practice, what we are going to see that it's far more complicated than that, and you can very easily transition from an image where the response is correct to an image where the response is incorrect. So the idea is quite simple. You start with an image X, which is properly classified, so let's call it X the input image and Y the proper label, Fxw the network prediction, and L the cross-entropy loss. What we can do is to do optimization the other way around. So instead of minimizing the loss, what we do during training, we optimize the parameters to minimize the loss. Here we are going to optimize the image, the input signal, instead of the parameters, and we are going to optimize it to maximize the loss. So here, if x, k is the image we get at iteration k of our gradient step, of our gradient descent, what the update is, we take the previous image and we add the gradient of the loss with respect to the image, so that we are going to very quickly increase the loss. So the counterintuitive result is that the resulting misclassified images are indistinguishable from the original ones to the human eye. So how to implement this? Again, it's very easy. We put in an input, we create a variable input with the image we want to perturbate. We load here an AlexNet pre-trained, define the cross entropy, define optimizer with SGD, move to CUDA. To avoid having to go back to the labels, what I do is simply to define a target which is a predicted class, and I picked images which are well classified, so this is a proper target. Move the target to CUDA and define the target as a variable. And now I'm going to do simply 15 steps of gradient ascent, where the loss now is minus cross entropy, and I do my backward step on the optimizer step. And this is the sort of things we get after 15 steps of optimization. This is the original image, well classified, and this is the adversarial image, which is incorrectly classified, and we'll come back to this in the next slide. And here's the difference between the two images, which I magnified a lot so that we see something, because otherwise it's just a gray image. So the difference, if we compute the norm of the difference divided by the norm of the original, it's 1%, and here it's 0.27%. So again, this guy is misclassified. So what we can do is to look at what is the predicted class through the gradient steps. At zeroth perturbation step, we have Weimaraner for this guy, which is it's a very Labrador-like dog, so it's absolutely correct. And this is classified as a desktop computer, which is correct. And when you go through the steps, you transition from this to Labrador Retriever, which is still okay, then Bruges Kangaroo, which is probably still kind of okay, and then you move to Sundial, which makes absolutely no sense, and which is probably triggered by those shapes, which look like shadows of a stick. That could probably be a pattern you see when you have a sundial. And then you stick on sundial for a while. If you take this guy and you do the same, you get desktop computer, at some point you transition to desk, which I think it's quite reasonable, because having a desktop computer floating in the air like this makes no sense. So it's reasonable that the network has captured the statistic that when you have a computer, you have actually a desk. Sundial, it's hard to understand. So what is even more counterintuitive is that, so if this is the original image, and this is an incorrectly classified image, if we sample images over the sphere of the same radius, so we take at random another image which is at the same distance as the adversarial one, it's properly classified. So it's not like you have a big chunk of images which are incorrectly classified. It's more like you have a very thin manifold, such that when you take the intersection between this manifold and the sphere, it's zero probability. You are very unlikely to meet it by pure luck. However, if you optimize, you end up on it. And finally, another work in this line of things is this work by Nguyen and colleagues in 2015, where what they did was to define a generative model of synthetic images and optimize images with some genetic optimization-like procedure to generate images which are strongly classified on some certain classes. And it's quite, on one hand, it makes no sense because they look like psychedelic wallpaper from the 70s, but on the other hand, there are things which are quite reassuring. That this is classified as bagel, this is classified as strawberries. It's again, it shows that some properties, reasonable properties, are captured and others are not. Some global properties are completely missed. But we cannot really expect more than that. If sea snake in the dataset are always in a greenish environment with some algae, vertical seaweeds floating around, it makes sense that this would trigger the sea snake label. Okay, and to finish this lecture, something completely unrelated, but there are those little technical things I have to explain, and I'm never very sure where to put them, but at least this will be useful for the next lecture about generative networks. So this is dilated convolution. So something I have not explained yet is that in standard convolution there is one more parameter. We saw that there is a filter size, number of channels on the padding, on the stride, but you also have the dilation. So what is the dilation? It's simply an expansion of the factor of expansion of the kernel without increasing the number of parameters. So this comes from the signal processing, where they have been having these notions for a long time, and it's also sometimes referred to as algorithm à trous from the French, which means with holes. And the idea is as follows. Imagine that for standard convolution, we would have a 3x3 filter, and we would get this, if we get this input, we get this output. And this actually can be seen as a dilation of 1, because here the distance between two non-zeros coefficients in the filter is 1. Basically, it's a dense filter. But we can perfectly increase this dilation. So, for instance, a dilation of 2, the filter would be like that. So there would be non-zeros only on the blue squares, and everything else would be zeros. And then the output, of course, the output map is smaller because the filter has to fit in. And so this is quite a simple idea, but it's actually very, very useful, because it allows you to increase the support your filter is looking at without increasing the number of parameters. So in many situations, it's really what you want. You want to very quickly allow a unit to have access to a very large field of view, so to speak. And here now, until you have this parameter, you really have to increase exponentially the computational cost and the memory footprint of your model. But now you can really control this. So it completely decorrelates the size of the support from the computational cost on the memory footprint. So a convolution with a 1D kernel of size k and dilation d can be interpreted as convolution with a filter of size 1 plus k minus 1d with only k non-zero coefficients. And for k equals 3 and d equals 4, the difference between the input map size and the output map size is. So it's basically the same computation as before, but now the filter, you have to take into account the dilation, the size of the filter. So this little piece of how to use the dilation in PyTorch, this little piece of code does it. So it's simply, you import again NN on tensor, autograd as usual, you create a variable around the tensor, and now you build your convolution module. Instead of letting the dilation be equal to 1, here I say it's equal to 4, which means that the filter is 3 plus 2 distance between the coefficients, which are in that case are going to be 3. So it's really 1 non-zero, 4 coefficients later, 1 non-zero, 4 coefficients later, 1 non-zero. So it's 4 plus 4 plus 1, so it's a resulting kernel of size 9. And now if you take 20 minus 9 plus 1, you get the 12, and the 30 minus 1 minus 9 plus 1 equal 22. So what is interesting in all this is that if you use, it's kind of a recent realization that if you use stride greater than 1 and dilation greater than 1, it allows you basically to remove pooling. So you can really reduce the size of your activation maps without having pooling modules. And from a philosophical perspective, from an aesthetic perspective, it's quite nice, because now if you don't use pooling, you have this nice situation where you have component-wise nonlinearities, ReLU and such, and you have parameterized linear operation that compute results as from the joint information between inputs. So you have those component-wise nonlinearities and joint parameterized linear operations, and that's it. Before, if you have max pooling, for instance, it's a weird animal, because it's both nonlinear and it computes a single value from a bunch of values, so it does some joint operation. If you use only dilation and stride, you completely separate those two things, point-wise nonlinear and joint parameterized linear operations. Okay, so that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed. And of course, as always, do not hesitate to drop me a mail for any comment or question or remark. Thanks a lot.